The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rural landscape as Matthew Larson pulled his pickup truck onto the gravel road leading to his farm. The drive was one he had taken hundreds of times over the years, but today it felt unfamiliar, almost surreal. A year ago, Matthew had left his 15-acre property to take care of his ailing sister in another state. His plan had been to return as soon as she recovered, and with her now back on her feet, he was finally coming home. As the truck rattled along the familiar road, Matthew's thoughts were filled with memories of the peaceful solitude his farm offered. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, and though farming was no longer his livelihood, he took great pride in maintaining the land. The rolling fields, the sturdy old barn, and the grove of oak trees near the stream were his sanctuary. Yet, as he approached the bend in the road that offered the first view of his property, he felt a creeping sense of unease. Something wasn't right. At first, he thought he had taken a wrong turn. In the distance, where his fields should have been, he saw the unmistakable outline of houses, rows of them, their skeletal frames jutting against the horizon like foreign invaders. He slowed the truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. Who would be building houses here? His farm wasn't for sale, and the surrounding land belonged to other farmers who, like him, cherished their open spaces. As he drove closer, the scale of the construction became apparent. It wasn't just a single house or a small project. There were at least 5 structures in various stages of completion, and construction crews were swarming like ants over the site. Trucks and heavy machinery cluttered the gravel access road that Matthew himself had installed years ago. His barn, a structure he had repaired with his own hands more times than he could count, was gone. In its place stood a cement foundation, a cruel mockery of the history that had once lived there. Matthew pulled his truck to a halt at the edge of what had once been his property line, his heart pounding. He stepped out, slamming the door behind him. The air smelled of sawdust and wet earth, mixed with the faint chemical tang of paint and concrete. A foreman in a hard hat spotted him and waved casually before returning to his clipboard. Matthew felt anger rise in his chest. How could someone act so nonchalant while standing on land that wasn't theirs to take? He marched toward the construction site, his boots kicking up dust with each determined step. Workers paused to watch him, their conversations trailing off as they noticed his expression. Matthew stopped in front of the foreman, who looked up from his clipboard with an air of impatience. "Can I help you, sir?" the foreman asked, raising an eyebrow. Matthew crossed his arms, his voice low and controlled. "What the hell is going on here? This is my land." The foreman blinked, clearly unprepared for such a confrontation. I think you've got the wrong place," he said, flipping through his clipboard. "This here is part of the Lakeside Homeowner Association development." "Lakeside Homeowner Association?" Matthew repeated, the words foreign and absurd. "This is my farm. Been in my family for over 70 years. Who gave you the right to build here?" The foreman hesitated, then gestured toward a sleek black SUV parked at the edge of the site. "You'll want to talk to the project manager about that. He handles all the permits and property stuff." Without another word, Matthew stormed toward the SUV. A man in a tailored suit stepped out as Matthew approached, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a business meeting. His smile was practiced but insincere. "Good afternoon," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm David Garrison, project manager for the Lakeside Homeowner Association development. What seems to be the issue?" Matthew ignored the handshake. "The issue," he said, his voice rising, "is that you're building houses on my property without my permission. What part of that do you not understand?" David's smile faltered, but only slightly. "Ah, I see. Well, I assure you, Mr. Larson." "Matthew Larson." "Mr. Larson," David continued smoothly, "this land was acquired legally through proper channels. Our records show it as part of the Lakeside Homeowner Association jurisdiction. If there's been some sort of mix-up, I'm sure we can sort it out." "A mix-up?" Matthew said, his fists clenching. "This isn't some clerical error. I didn't sell my land. I didn't agree to anything. You're trespassing, plain and simple." David's expression hardened. "I'm afraid I'll have to disagree. The zoning records we obtained from the county clearly show this parcel as part of the development. If you have concerns, I suggest you take them up with the county office." Before Matthew could respond, a construction crew began unloading materials near what used to be his pasture. He turned toward the noise, his blood boiling. "Get those trucks off my land right now," he shouted. The workers hesitated, looking toward David for guidance. David raised a hand, signaling them to continue. "I'm sorry, Mr. Larson," he said, his tone now condescending, "but we have a tight schedule to keep. Unless you can provide documentation proving your claims, we have no reason to halt construction." Matthew felt a surge of helplessness mixed with rage. He had all the documentation, deeds, maps, surveys stored safely in his house, but the very idea that he had to prove ownership of land he had lived on for decades was infuriating. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he said through gritted teeth. David gave a small shrug. "That's your right. Have a nice day, Mr. Larson." As Matthew turned and walked back to his truck, he felt the weight of the situation settle on him. His home, his history, and his future were all under threat, and the battle to reclaim what was rightfully his was only beginning. The long drive back to town was filled with 1,000 questions. How had this happened? Who was responsible? And most importantly, how could he stop it? By the time he reached his house, night had fallen. The familiar creak of the porch steps offered little comfort as he stepped inside and flicked on the lights. He went straight to his office, pulling out the thick file of paperwork that documented every detail of his property. As he sifted through the pages, he resolved to fight with everything he had. This was his land, and no amount of bureaucratic incompetence or corporate greed was going to take it from him. The battle for justice had begun. Matthew Larson woke up at the crack of dawn, the anger from the day before still simmering beneath the surface. As sunlight streamed through the window of his modest farmhouse, he resolved that today would be the day he began his fight against the homeowner association trespassers. Armed with the thick file of property records he'd unearthed last night, he knew he needed answers, and he knew where to start: the county zoning office. The drive to the office was long and uneventful, giving him time to rehearse what he would say. His mind spun with the absurdity of the situation. How could a mistake this egregious happen? More importantly, how could anyone think they could take over private land without so much as a phone call? He pulled into the county building's parking lot, grabbed his file, and marched inside. The zoning office was a cramped, dimly lit room with rows of cubicles and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. A receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up as he approached. "Can I help you?" she asked in a monotone voice, her fingers tapping away at a keyboard. "Yes, you can," Matthew said firmly. "I need to speak to someone about a serious mistake in your zoning records. My private property, has been falsely registered as part of an homeowner association development." The receptionist sighed, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke. "Do you have a parcel number?" Matthew flipped open his file, pulling out a well-worn map of his property. "Right here," he said, pointing to the highlighted section. She took the map and typed the number into her computer. After a few moments, she frowned. "Huh," she muttered, tilting the monitor slightly. "It's showing up as part of the Lakeside Homeowner Association jurisdiction." "That's the problem," Matthew snapped. "It's not. I've owned this land for decades. I have the deed, surveys, everything to prove it's mine." The receptionist handed the map back to him. "You'll need to talk to the zoning supervisor," she said, gesturing toward a row of cubicles. "Second desk on the left. His name's Paul." Matthew wasted no time heading to Paul's desk. The supervisor was a balding man in his late 40s, hunched over a stack of papers with a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. When Matthew introduced himself and explained the situation, Paul leaned back in his chair, eyebrows furrowed. "This sounds complicated," Paul said. "Let me pull up the file and take a look." As Paul typed, Matthew tapped his foot impatiently. He didn't have time for bureaucratic delays. After a few moments, Paul let out a low whistle. "Well, here's the issue," Paul said, swiveling the monitor to face Matthew. "Your property was mistakenly included in a rezoning project about 2 years ago. It was supposed to cover just the area surrounding the lakeside development, but somehow your parcel got added to the map." "Somehow," Matthew repeated, his voice rising. "You're telling me my land was stolen because of a clerical error?" Paul held up a hand. "Calm down, Mr. Larson. It wasn't stolen, it's a zoning issue. Technically, the homeowner association doesn't own your land. They just think they have the right to develop it because of this map." Matthew leaned forward, glaring at the screen. "Well, they're building houses on my land as we speak. Does that sound like they don't think they own it?" Paul winced. "That's not good. They shouldn't have started construction without verifying ownership. This definitely needs to be corrected." "And how do we do that?" Matthew demanded. "I want this fixed now." Paul sighed, pulling a thick binder from a shelf behind him. "We'll need to file a correction request with the county records office. It's a process, and it might take some time." "How much time?" Matthew asked, his patience wearing thin. "Weeks, maybe months," Paul admitted. "But in the meantime, you could issue a cease and desist order to stop the construction. You'll need a lawyer for that." Matthew groaned, rubbing his temples. The last thing he wanted was a drawn-out legal battle, but it seemed he had no choice. "Fine," he said. "Give me everything I need to start this process." Paul nodded, printing out a stack of forms. "Fill these out and submit them to the county clerk's office. I'll do what I can to expedite the correction on my end." Matthew stuffed the forms into his file and left the office, his frustration mounting. The idea that his property could be tied up in red tape because of someone else's mistake was infuriating. Still, he knew he couldn't stop now. He needed to take the next step. That next step took him to the office of Barbara Klein, a local attorney with a reputation for handling property disputes. Her office was small but tidy, with shelves lined with thick legal textbooks. Barbara greeted him warmly, offering him a seat across from her desk. "So, Mr. Larson," she said, flipping through the documents he had brought. "Let me get this straight. The homeowner association is building on your land, claiming it's theirs because of a zoning error?" "That's right," Matthew said. "And I want them off my property as soon as possible." Barbara nodded, tapping a pen against her desk as she reviewed the paperwork. "You're in a strong position. You have the deed, surveys, and a clear history of ownership. The zoning error complicates things, but it doesn't change the fact that this is your land." "So what do we do?" Matthew asked. "First, we file a cease and desist order to stop the construction. That'll buy us some time to sort out the zoning issue. Second, we notify the homeowner association that they're trespassing and demand they remove their equipment and materials." "And if they refuse?" Matthew asked. "Then we sue," Barbara said bluntly. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that." Matthew left Barbara's office feeling slightly more optimistic. The cease and desist order was filed that afternoon, and Barbara assured him it would be delivered to the homeowner association the next day. For the first time since discovering the construction, Matthew felt like he was regaining some control. The next morning, Matthew returned to his property to see if the construction had stopped. To his dismay, the workers were still there, hammering away as though nothing had happened. He spotted the foreman from the day before and stormed over. "I thought I made myself clear," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is my land, and you have no right to be here." The foreman looked up, clearly annoyed. "We haven't received any orders to stop." "Well, you will," Matthew said. "And when you do, I expect every single one of you off my property." As he walked away, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. The homeowner association had money, lawyers, and resources on their side. But Matthew had something stronger, the truth, and he was determined to see it through. Matthew Larson stood on his porch, the cool morning air doing little to calm the simmering anger inside him. The cease and desist order had been served to the Lakeside Homeowner Association 2 days ago, but the construction on his property hadn't stopped. Trucks continued to rumble down his gravel road, workers hammered away at wooden frames, and his land was being transformed into a suburban development before his eyes. It was as if the legal document meant nothing to them, and that blatant disregard for the law only fueled his resolve. He dialed Barbara Klein's number, the attorney who had been his lifeline in this mess. After a few rings, her calm, professional voice answered. "Barbara, it's Matthew," he began, pacing across the porch. "They're still building. The cease and desist didn't do a damn thing." Barbara sighed on the other end. "Unfortunately, that doesn't surprise me. Some homeowner associations think they're untouchable. But don't worry, this works in our favor. Their refusal to comply strengthens our case. It shows blatant disregard for legal boundaries." "So, what's the next step?" Matthew asked, gripping the railing as he watched a cement mixer churn on his property. "We move to the next stage, filing for an injunction," Barbara said. "It's a court order that will legally force them to stop all activity until the property dispute is resolved. It's more powerful than a cease and desist, and ignoring it comes with serious legal consequences." "How long will that take?" Matthew pressed. Time was not on his side. Every day more damage was done to his land. "I'll draft the paperwork today and submit it to the court," Barbara explained. "With the evidence we have, I'm confident a judge will grant the injunction quickly, but we also need to prepare for the long haul. This isn't just about stopping construction, it's about making sure your ownership is officially recognized, and that means we'll have to address the zoning error head-on." Matthew thanked her and hung up, his mind swirling with frustration and determination. He knew this fight would take time, but the idea of seeing his family's land permanently altered by an overzealous homeowner association made his blood boil. This farm was more than just land, it was his heritage, his sanctuary. He wasn't going to let them take it. Later that day, Matthew drove into town to meet with Barbara. Her office was a hub of activity, with assistants bustling around and phones ringing incessantly. Barbara greeted him with a firm handshake and led him into her private office, where a stack of papers awaited his signature. "This is the injunction request," she explained, sliding the documents across the desk. "It outlines the zoning error, your ownership history, and their illegal actions. Once filed, it should take a few days for the court to issue the order. In the meantime, we'll need to start gathering additional evidence to strengthen your case." "What kind of evidence?" Matthew asked. Anything that proves the homeowner association knew they were overstepping their bounds, Barbara replied. Emails, construction permits, communications with the county zoning office. If we can show they acted knowingly and willfully, it'll make your case even stronger. Matthew nodded, a grim determination settling over him. How do we get that kind of information? Barbara smiled faintly. Leave that to me. I'll issue a subpoena for their records. They'll have no choice but to hand over anything relevant to the case. A week later, Matthew sat in a packed courtroom, his nerves on edge. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, called the case to order. Barbara presented their argument with precision, detailing the zoning error, Matthew's ownership records, and the homeowner association's refusal to halt construction despite the cease and desist order. The homeowner association's attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, argued that the development was a matter of public interest, claiming that the housing project would benefit the community. He downplayed the zoning error as a minor oversight and insisted that stopping construction would cause significant financial losses. But Barbara was relentless. She pointed out that financial losses were irrelevant when weighed against the unlawful occupation of private property. She presented aerial photos of Matthew's land before and after construction, highlighting the irreversible damage already done. Finally, she submitted the cease and desist order as evidence of the homeowner association's blatant disregard for legal procedures. After hours of arguments, the judge rendered her decision. The injunction was granted. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge's gavel struck, silencing any objections. The homeowner association was officially ordered to halt all construction activities on Matthew's property, effective immediately. For the first time in weeks, Matthew felt a glimmer of hope. That evening, he drove back to his farm, expecting to find an empty construction site. Instead, he was met with the same flurry of activity workers hammering away, trucks unloading materials, and the foreman barking orders. Rage boiled over as Matthew stormed onto the site, waving a copy of the court order. "This stops now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're breaking the law." The foreman, who had previously brushed him off, now looked uneasy. "I need to call the homeowner association board," he muttered, stepping away. Matthew stood his ground, his fists clenched. "You can call whoever you want, but if I see another nail hammered into that wood, I'll be calling the sheriff." Within the hour, the site was cleared. Trucks rumbled away, workers packed up their tools, and the land was eerily quiet for the first time in weeks. Matthew stood alone in the fading light, his heart pounding. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this small victory felt monumental. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Barbara's subpoena yielded a trove of damning evidence: emails between homeowner association board members discussing the zoning error, internal memos acknowledging that the land wasn't legally theirs, and even a contractor's report warning against proceeding with construction. It was a treasure trove that painted a clear picture of willful negligence. Meanwhile, the Lakeside Homeowner Association launched a counterattack, filing a lawsuit against Matthew for interfering with community development. Their accusations were flimsy at best, but it was clear they intended to drag the case out as long as possible, hoping to outspend Matthew in legal fees. But Matthew refused to back down. He rallied support from neighbors, many of whom were outraged by the homeowner association's overreach. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David vs. Goliath battle that resonated with audiences. Donations poured in from supporters who wanted to see justice served. As the legal battle escalated, Matthew felt the weight of the fight pressing down on him. The financial strain, the sleepless nights, and the constant anxiety took their toll. But every time he thought about giving up, he looked out at his land, the land his grandfather had tilled with his bare hands, the land where he had built countless memories, and he knew he couldn't quit. This wasn't just about property. It was about standing up for what was right, for the principle that no one, no matter how powerful or well-connected, had the right to take what wasn't theirs. And Matthew was willing to fight to the bitter end to prove it. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Word of Matthew Larson's battle against the Lakeside Homeowner Association had spread through the community, drawing curious onlookers and local journalists eager to see the outcome of the high-profile case. Matthew sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Barbara Klein and her legal assistant. Across the aisle, the Homeowner Association's attorney, Richard Calloway, exuded confidence as he leafed through his notes. The board members sat behind him, their faces carefully blank, though some exchanged whispers as the proceedings began. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Judge Eleanor Pierce, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp intellect, took her seat at the bench. She surveyed the room with a piercing gaze, her presence commanding immediate respect. "Let's begin," she said, her voice firm but measured. This court is convened to address the case of Larson versus the Lakeside Homeowners Association. The issue at hand is the alleged illegal occupation and development of private property. Both sides will have the opportunity to present their arguments and evidence. Mr. Calloway, you may begin. Calloway rose smoothly, his tailored suit and practiced demeanor giving him an air of authority. He launched into a polished opening statement, painting the Homeowner Association as a benevolent organization committed to community development. According to him, the inclusion of Matthew's property in their plans was an innocent mistake, a clerical error that had been blown out of proportion. This development was intended to benefit the community, Calloway said, his voice dripping with sincerity. While we acknowledge that a zoning error occurred, we maintain that the Homeowner Association acted in good faith based on the information available at the time. We ask the court to consider the broader implications of halting this project, which serves the public interest. Matthew clenched his fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew better than to interrupt, but it was difficult to listen to Calloway's calculated misrepresentation of the facts. When it was Barbara's turn, she stood confidently, her voice steady and deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about community development or public interest. It's about the unlawful seizure of private property. My client, Matthew Larson, has owned this land for decades. The Lakeside Homeowner Association not only failed to verify their claims to the property but also ignored warnings and legal notices, proceeding with construction in blatant disregard for the law. We intend to prove that their actions were not only negligent but willful. The first few days of the trial were devoted to presenting evidence. Barbara began by establishing Matthew's ownership of the land, submitting a series of documents, the deed, survey maps, and tax records, all meticulously organized. She called a land surveyor to the stand who testified that the boundaries of Matthew's property had been unchanged for over 70 years. There was no ambiguity, his land was not part of the Lakeside Homeowner Association's jurisdiction. Calloway attempted to undermine the surveyor's credibility, suggesting that zoning maps from the county contradicted the survey. But Barbara countered with devastating precision. She presented emails obtained through a subpoena, showing that the Homeowner Association had been aware of the zoning error months before construction began. The emails revealed that the board had chosen to proceed anyway, banking on Matthew's inability to fight back. One particularly damning email from the Homeowner Association president read, "Even if he contests it, we can tie him up in legal proceedings for years. By the time it's resolved, the houses will be finished, and he won't have the resources to undo it." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the email was read aloud. Judge Pierce frowned, her sharp gaze fixed on the defense table. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her tone icy, "would you care to explain this correspondence?" Calloway shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, this email does not reflect the views of the entire board. It was an isolated comment taken out of context." "Context or not," Barbara interjected, "it clearly demonstrates the Homeowner Association's intent to exploit my client's property for their own gain, knowing full well they had no legal claim to it." The turning point came when Barbara called one of the construction contractors to the stand. The man, reluctant but bound by the subpoena, admitted that he had raised concerns about the legality of the project during its early stages. "I told them something didn't seem right," he said, his voice uneasy. "But they told me to keep quiet and keep working. Said it wasn't my problem." This testimony, combined with the damning emails, painted a picture of an homeowner association that had knowingly and willfully violated Matthew's property rights. The defense tried to argue that the construction was too far along to be stopped without causing significant financial losses, but Barbara dismissed this as irrelevant. "Financial inconvenience does not justify illegal activity," she said, her words ringing through the courtroom. As the trial neared its conclusion, Matthew took the stand. He spoke about his connection to the land, his family's history, and the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on him. His voice wavered as he described the moment he discovered the construction, but his resolve was clear. "This isn't just about money or property," he said, looking directly at the judge. "It's about standing up for what's right. If we let organizations like the Homeowner Association trample over individuals, where does it stop? This land is my legacy, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." Calloway's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to paint Matthew as stubborn and unwilling to compromise, but the jury saw through the tactic. By the time he stepped down, it was clear that the momentum was firmly on Matthew's side. In her closing argument, Barbara tied everything together. "This case is about power and accountability," she said. "The Lakeside Homeowner Association believed they could take what wasn't theirs simply because they had the resources to do so. They ignored the law, ignored warnings, and dismissed my client's rights. Today we have the opportunity to send a message that no one is above the law, and that justice will prevail." When Calloway gave his closing statement, it felt hollow in comparison. He reiterated the same points about public interest and financial losses, but the weight of the evidence against the homeowner association was overwhelming. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict in Matthew's favor. The judge ordered the homeowner association to pay damages, restore the land to its original state, and halt all construction permanently. She also issued personal fines against several board members for their role in the scheme, sending a clear message about the consequences of their actions. As the gavel struck, Matthew felt a wave of relief and vindication. The fight had been long and arduous, but justice had been served. The days following the verdict were bittersweet. Matthew knew the battle wasn't truly over. There was still work to be done to repair the damage to his land and rebuild what had been lost. But as he stood on his porch, watching the construction crews dismantle the illegal structures, he felt a renewed sense of hope. His farm, his legacy, was safe once again. The court's decision in Matthew Larson's favor was the victory he had fought so hard to achieve, but it was only the beginning of the final chapter in his battle. As he drove back to his farm the morning after the ruling, the reality of what came next began to sink in. The judge's orders had been clear. The Lakeside Homeowner Association was required to cease all construction, remove every trace of their development, and restore the land to its original state. Additionally, they were to compensate Matthew for damages including emotional distress, legal fees, and the loss of use of his property during the conflict. But undoing months of damage wouldn't happen overnight. The land bore scars, both literal and metaphorical, and healing them would require patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to rebuilding. When Matthew arrived at the farm, the sight of the half-built houses still standing on his land filled him with a mix of anger and determination. Heavy equipment and construction materials were scattered across the property like discarded remnants of an invasion. Workers were already packing up, some loading supplies onto trucks, others dismantling frames that had once symbolized the homeowner association's overreach. As the engines of bulldozers roared to life, Matthew stood by the edge of his field, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Barbara Klein, his attorney, had arranged for court-appointed inspectors to oversee the restoration process. They met Matthew at the property that morning, clipboards in hand, ready to document every detail. Barbara had assured him that the court's ruling left no room for shortcuts. The homeowner association was obligated to restore every inch of his land to the condition it had been in before construction began. "Mr. Larson," one of the inspectors said, approaching him with a professional but sympathetic expression, "we'll make sure they follow through on every detail." The court was explicit. They can't cut corners. Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. "Good. This land has been in my family for generations. It deserves to be treated with respect." Over the following weeks, Matthew watched as the dismantling unfolded. The process was slow and methodical, overseen by a mix of court-appointed workers and contractors hired by the homeowner association. The half-built houses were torn down piece by piece, the materials hauled away to avoid further contamination of the land. Cement foundations were jackhammered into rubble, then removed to make way for soil restoration. Grass seed was spread over areas that had been stripped bare, and irrigation systems were set up to help the fields recover. As the physical scars began to fade, Matthew turned his attention to rebuilding his farm's infrastructure. The old barn, a beloved structure that had been demolished during the early stages of the homeowner association's construction, weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of his family's history, a place where his grandfather had stored tools, and where Matthew had spent countless hours as a boy, learning the rhythms of farm life. With the compensation he had received from the court ruling, Matthew decided to rebuild the barn. He wanted it to honor the past while embracing the future, a blend of tradition and renewal. He hired a local contractor who specialized in custom barns, working closely with him to design a structure that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. As the new barn took shape, neighbors and community members began to visit the farm, offering their support and encouragement. Many had followed Matthew's story closely, cheering for his victory against the homeowner association. Some brought meals, others offered to help with labor, and a few even shared their own stories of battles with overreaching organizations. The farm, once isolated, became a hub of community spirit. The homeowner association, meanwhile, was dealing with the fallout of their defeat. The court's decision had not only tarnished their reputation but also left them facing significant financial penalties. Several board members resigned in disgrace, and the remaining leadership scrambled to manage the backlash. News outlets continued to cover the story, framing it as a cautionary tale of unchecked power and greed. Matthew's victory also sparked broader conversations about property rights and homeowner association overreach. local lawmakers began pushing for reforms to prevent similar incidents, including stricter zoning regulations and more oversight for homeowners associations. For Matthew, knowing that his battle might inspire change was a small but meaningful consolation. Months later, as autumn settled over the countryside, the new barn was completed. It stood tall and proud, its sleek design blending seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Inside, it featured modern amenities, spacious storage areas, a loft for hay, and even a small office space where Matthew could manage the farm's operations. But the heart of the barn was a simple wooden plaque mounted near the entrance, engraved with the words Larson Family Farm established 1938. The barn's completion was celebrated with a gathering of friends, neighbors, and supporters. Matthew hosted the event on the newly restored land, setting up tables under the sprawling oak trees that had stood untouched throughout the ordeal. As people mingled and shared stories, the atmosphere was one of triumph and renewal. During the gathering, Matthew stood before the crowd, raising a glass of cider as he addressed them. "This farm has seen its share of storms, but it's still standing," he began, his voice steady and clear. "What happened here wasn't just about land. It was about fighting for what's right, for the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to take what doesn't belong to them. I couldn't have done this alone. To all of you who stood by me, who supported me, I can't thank you enough. This barn, this farm, it's not just mine, it's ours." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound carrying across the fields like a celebration of justice. For Matthew, it was a moment of closure. The fight was over, and the farm was his again, not just in name, but in spirit. In the months and years that followed, the farm thrived. The fields, once marred by construction, grew lush and green. Wildlife returned to the stream, and the oak grove remained a place of quiet reflection. Matthew continued to farm, but he also became an advocate for property rights, sharing his story at community events and with local organizations. His experience had taught him the value of standing up for what was right, no matter how daunting the challenge. And though the scars of the battle would always remain, Matthew knew that they were part of the farm's story, a testament to its resilience and to his determination to protect it. As he stood one evening on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Matthew felt a deep sense of peace. The land stretched out before him, a patchwork of fields and trees, vibrant and alive. It was his, just as it always had been, and it would remain so for generations to come. Justice had been served. The farm had been restored, and Matthew Larson, against all odds, had prevailed.